Are we on live now?
I think so, Joceyln.
All right. Well, let's get started because I'm hoping that people have waited a long time for, well, at least, a couple of weeks since we announced that we were doing this. Welcome, Dr. Janet Smylie. Hello.
Hey, Joceyln. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Really enjoyed our last chat, so I'm glad we were able to come together again for this second Take Care in COVID webinar between the partnership between the National Association of Friendship Centers and Well Living House. This time around, we're talking about the second wave, this mysterious second wave that we've been hearing about since the first wave. I don't know if that first wave has really started or really ended, I mean. But also it's important for us to prepare as much as possible for the second wave, keep our circle safe, and to help ourselves and each other get through whatever this might be. I think it's a bit of a scary time because we have some experience of COVID, but from what leadership has been telling us, public health officials, that this might be even worse than the first round. And I think people still are remembering about that first lockdown and how isolated we felt, how powerless we felt, and we know a little bit more now, but I think there's a lot more that we don't know. And so tonight we're hoping to have some conversations with you, answer some questions, and hopefully we all come away feeling a little bit more prepared or a little bit more comforted in what we already know and how we can prepare for that second wave.
Sounds great, Joceyln. Little bit of feedback from me, but hopefully that'll get better. Sounds better already. Yeah, there's a lot of jargon and a lot of anxiety that comes with COVID. So hopefully we can chat about some of the jargon and look at the strengths and resiliencies and some of the great things we already know about managing COVID. But before we get started, we're all wearing orange shirts today. And I know that there's been some awesome Orange Shirt Day activities happening across the country. So we wanted to dedicate tonight's session about what is the second wave and what can we do to keep our circles safe. We wanted to dedicate that to all our relatives, all our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis relatives who we've lost to preventable and treatable illness. Not only infectious diseases, but actually also as we witness the horrific loss of Joyce Echequan, the losses of life and illness that happened because of racism in access to health services. So yeah, our thoughts go out to Joyce and her family and her community and all our other relatives who have lost somebody to an infectious disease and or to racism and lack of adequate care in the health system.
Thank you, Janet. And yes, just before we continue, for anyone who is looking for the French translation, it's going to be in the chat feature. So you click on that and you'll have access to our simultaneous French translation. So pour les traductions simultanées en français, il existe un lien web sur lequel cliquer. So c'est mon français pour tonight. I'm still working on my French, but we wanted to ensure that this conversation was accessible for those who speak French. And so, yeah, thank you so much for that reminder. It's, of course, Orange Shirt Day, very emotional to remember those folks who went to residential schools, those who weren't able to come home. And I'm glad that we can start tonight in acknowledging them and dedicating this time to them. And of course, it's part of that same legacy, I think, with residential schools, as the systemic and institutional racism and what Joyce had experienced within the medical field just in the last few days. And as we think about our own families and keeping ourselves safe, in addition to everything that we deal with on a daily basis, we're also in the midst of this global pandemic. So maybe you can just share with us a little bit about your perspective on this second wave and how we think that we can best prepare for this second wave.
Okay, for sure. So a couple of key messages. The first thing is that we are in a wave. One could call it a second wave of COVID, but I believe most of our viewers already know everything they need to meet it and successfully make it through. We're already prepared and we know what to do. I guess another message, just because racism has been linked to COVID, right? Like we saw huge demonstrations in Canada. I mean, it's a day-to-day reality for us as Indigenous people. We've witnessed, a couple days before Orange Shirt Day, which deals with the racist violence of residential schools, the unnecessary death of Joyce when she went to the hospital to get care. But what we want to do is put all that energy and angst into actually taking care of ourselves, like in a good way, in a protocoled way, because we actually all need to actually be extra strong and extra careful so that we can go on and do that work to make a better world, to protect Mother Earth, to make it through this teaching of COVID, our trickster auntie, our tricky relative who can harm us if we're not careful. Okay, so the first thing, don't be worried, people, you hear all this jargon. Is it first wave, second wave? Did we actually really have a wave? So here we just see, this is what they're talking about, the data geek people. I think I'm one of them. But really, we all know what waves are. We watch the ocean. So basically, we just draw these curves over time, like of how many people have an infectious disease. So actually, the one I showed you wasn't COVID. It was influenza. Influenza went around the world in 1918, and actually the second wave was worse than the first wave. There's so much anxiety around COVID, though. I think one thing which is really amazing overall as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in what is called a first wave in Canada, that started in March when we started seeing the shutdowns across the country and kids stayed home from school. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people did amazingly well in terms of infection and death. We did have infection, we did have death, particularly in urban areas. It was hidden. And of course, as many of our listeners know, huge impacts, like in terms of access to services and other care. But we also pulled together to make it through, and we learned a lot. So some of the most important things, one of the most important things that we can do this fall, as we see an increase in cases again, and what happens with these waves is that you can see they're kind of steep, right? And then people might have heard, remember in March, they were talking about the doubling time, because this COVID germ, it's kind of like a rabbit or another creature that reproduces very quickly once it gets going. So basically we're now in an upswing, and it's not just like every day, there's 2 more viruses and then 2 more viruses and 2 more viruses. It doubles. So it has what's called exponential growth. So that, we started in Ontario over the summer, we got down to about under 100 cases. But now over September, we saw it creep up to 200 and then 400. And then, within the next week, it'll be 800. And we can kind of manage that. But in Ontario, once we start getting, to 1,600, right? That's going to be tricky to manage. Okay, so that's what they're talking about. So the single most important thing that we could do is keep our circles small. Okay. By circle or bubble, that's the people that you're living with. It's the people that are getting into your space. Okay, so you can still see people safely. One needs to be careful and more careful with seniors and other people that might have compromised immune systems. So they're ill with a chronic disease. But in order to see someone safely, you have to be socially distanced, wear a mask, right? And not touch things. So it's very hard. There's amazing stories. I heard a story yesterday from a healthcare practitioner colleague about an elderly woman who actually lives in a 1-bedroom apartment here in Toronto with a family member who has COVID. And because they're so awesome, they figured out actually how to isolate the elder and still take care of the elder and still stay socially distanced. But it's hard. I don't know that I could do it very well. Okay? So the single most important thing that we can all do together is to keep our circles small. What we saw in Toronto is over the summer when we were able to dampen down the COVID, right? Like Auntie had a little nap. We actually, on average, all of us only had 4 contacts every day, right? And that would have been contacts, people in our social circles. But actually in Toronto, we've been kind of naughty and I guess restless over the fall. So it's gone up to 8.5. And of course it goes a bit higher in the schools. In the schools, they are trying to reduce like the contact by keeping people socially distanced, wearing masks and washing hands. But I heard a story about outside a school where there was 20 kids not socially distanced, not wearing masks. And again, of course, one can only imagine how difficult it is for young people at important stages of socialization to have to do that. It's a big sacrifice for them. So that's number one, is just try to keep your circles small. It doesn't mean that you can't see people. It is very hard though. I saw one of my aunties and, you know, we had a lovely conversation outside, socially distanced, right? But then at the end, it's like, well, can I give you a hug? Because of course we crave that contact and that would be a normal thing to do. So that was very hard.
Yeah.
So we're safe until we're not safe. One of the ideas I had for myself is like at the end of every day, just count up how many people did I let into my bubble, right? And it's almost like distracted driving or safer sex, right? Like we're safe until we're not safe. So what we see is those little slip ups. It's just normal human behavior. What do you think, Joss?
It is really hard. I mean, it's, you know, Thanksgiving is coming up in a couple of weeks and soon it's going to be Christmas and we've already been apart for so long. So when we see people that we are happy to see, we want to hug them. We trust them. And so we think like, well, if we're here together in person, then it must be okay. And I think just to drive home that point is even just a little while ago, I know of a situation where, somebody was at a baby shower and there was distancing and there was hand sanitizer and like everything, those protocols were followed. But, you know, there was family there and we want to hug our family. And so found out later that the next day that someone who was there had been in contact, not until after the baby shower, thankfully, but had been in contact with someone who was awaiting a test, and eventually that test came back positive. So, you know, you are safe until you're not, and I think it's not that we don't trust our family members and our friends, but it's really so hard to predict, to know where people have been and who they've been in contact with. That one little slip up like that could have potentially affected like 20 people, right? And I think we've heard a lot about that in the last little while about it's not people picking up COVID from the grocery store or from, just being outside. It's from feeling safe or safer with a smaller group and then finding out later that maybe somebody in that small group wasn't as safe as we had thought. So yeah, it's very hard.
I think it's, so that whole point, I know there was a really good Facebook sharing by a young First Nations man who actually traveled to a community funeral and again got like really sick on the way home. But it was because they'd been very, very careful where they'd been living, but at the funeral there was hugging, right? So that's really hard. How do we not do that hugging at a funeral? So yeah, there is still quite a bit of sacrifice involved. The other thing I was going to say is we've learned more about COVID. So the messages change all the time. And even some of the stuff we produced early on, there was early theories about how important droplet spread was, like droplets on things, right? So we were always like, some of it came actually, I think, because some healthcare providers were catching COVID from each other. So they assumed that they were staying socially distanced, but maybe there wasn't as much social distance like in the staff rooms as we thought. So it turns out a lot of that transition was in the airborne droplet, which is why at first people weren't so worried about masks, right? But there's strong evidence like around wearing masks. Even if Joe Biden, my mask is even bigger than Joe Biden's. Yesterday, apparently he was accused of having a big mask, but wearing big masks is really cool. Okay. So just saying though, maybe Joceyln, if you had a big mask, I'd look cooler because I don't think I'm as cool as maybe only in my own mind.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, it's, you know, we do know a little bit more now. And what would you say that the information that we know from the first wave of COVID could help us stay safe for the second wave? I mean, yes, we know about the masks and we're hearing more about the transmission and how it's transmitted. I don't know if you could share any more about.
Yeah. So basically what we know for sure, because we thought there's lots of things, but there's actually 3 key behaviors that are really going to help us, right? One is wearing masks. And it's interesting, my son told me the other morning that, you know, masks actually reduce spread by more than 75% almost, right? So wow. I think this was in the debate last night too, that if you wear a mask, if I'm only wearing a mask, say Joceyln, we are in the same room, and I have COVID, by wearing this mask, I'm going to reduce your risk by 50%.
Right.
But if you're actually wearing a mask too, then it has to go through my mask and your mask, right? So then that reduces it down to a quarter. So if we all just started wearing masks when we're out, even though I know that, yes, sometimes that can be very hard for people who are dependent on lip reading or for people who feel a bit claustrophobic. So we need to make accommodations. But the 3 behaviors really, now we know: social distancing, wearing a mask, and washing our hands frequently for at least 20 seconds, right? So you have to figure out your favorite song. I'm sure people talk about different songs. We have to come up with different First Nations, Inuit, and Métis songs that we sing, and how many rounds would you have to do, you know, a strong woman song, for example, when you're washing your hands.
Or something from Buffy St. Marie, probably.
Yeah, exactly. For me. That's great. Cool. Yeah, love it. So yeah, that's another thing people can do right now. And you can put it in the chat. What'll be your hand washing song? And the idea is to make sure that it's 20 seconds long.
Yeah.
And then just keeping your circle small, the people that come inside your bubble, and checking on that. That's another thing that we know. And if we could reduce that down to 4, you know, we could stop the second wave again. Though, of course, you know, it's been really important to get, you know, some of our economies opened up and our kids back in school. Another thing that can be really important about the fall season is we're going to have the flu. So we don't have a vaccine for COVID, but we do have for the flu. So it makes it kind of extra important to try to get your flu shot. And then the other thing that you said, Joceyln, that's really important is to stay home. Like if you've gone to get a test, then that means you're worried or you've had an exposure. So you shouldn't be going out. So I heard about a political event where a political leader in one of our communities actually went, even though they didn't have their test result back, right? So, and again, like we're lonely, we want to be in family groups, right? But Yeah, and now there's big lineups and delays to get tests in many places. But if you're getting that test, then that means you should lay low. So that's, I think the breakouts that I've heard are people, you know, like in community events, like where they're hugging, right? Like we've heard about a couple outbreaks there, like at some funerals. And that's really hard. People going to events when they've had a test and then they end up testing positive. And then people just having large social gatherings and not paying attention. So to the basic rules. And again, that's hard too. We're lonely and we like having large rowdy social gatherings, at least where I come from. So none of those are easy, but if we can put all of our passion and anger, right, like around all of the racism into protecting ourselves, maybe that will help fuel us.
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate that. Just wanted to give you a chance to take a sip of water there.
Thank you.
And I think that with with what you're saying, you know, we're a bit more comfortable with the masks than we were, I think, the first time we had our conversation. And I'm hoping, you know, we take on harm reduction in a lot of other spaces, and I'm hoping that in this space we can kind of do sort of the same thing, that if we are going to be in close contact with people, or if we are going to gather because we don't want to miss, you know, a family event or a funeral or something, that we can at least pause on the personal touching, but at the very least, like you said, that COVID's in the air, and so wearing that mask will really help reduce, so that even if we are not advising it, but if we are going to be in those spaces, that at least, very least, wear the mask to try to stop that spread.
Yeah, the other thing that I find helpful that I've been thinking about from the very beginning is just the seasons. And I was sharing, I remember a long time, one of my aunties giving me a teaching. I was in a new relationship and I wanted to have babies right away. And I was advised to wait 2 years with my new partner. So in that first year, I would get to know them every season and see what they're like across the 4 seasons, right? And then in the second year, I could see their patterns in those seasons and recognize them. Then after that, maybe we would be ready to try to have kids together. So COVID, and remember, we've talked about COVID like as a tricky relative, that's out of balance, right? A relative that's hurting and then will hurt others, right? And create a disturbance. So loves a large gathering, loves it when we're not careful, then he or she will come out and harm us. Basically we have 4 seasons in this first year of COVID. So it's a long haul, but we're more than halfway through, right?
Yeah.
So we had a very difficult spring. That's the first season. Summer, we had a little bit of respite. We had less cases, we could relax, but now it's fall. And many of us know that fall is a time where we have to prepare, right? And winter, like where I come from, wasn't a cakewalk out on the prairies, right? But we had lots of time to reflect and tell stories, and we had that clear, cold winter air, right? So we have gifts in each season. So yeah, if we just think about it, okay, it's fall now, so we're ready. Anti-COVID's going to display some fall colors, right? And then anti-COVID's or Uncle COVID is going to produce some winter storms. But by the time we come through winter and we're getting into spring, right, we'll probably have another second year with COVID, but every season we learn more about how to deal with them. We'll be better equipped with a vaccine. So I don't know about other people, but that's a way that I can manage with the fatigue as well, and just say, okay, well, it's fall. What do I need to know about fall? So this fall, what we need to know is keep our circles small, figure out what songs we're going to wash our hands to, start having fashion masks. So this one, I had things I could choose from tonight. I wore this one last time. I really like it. It came out early. It's a handmade mask. Dorothy Grant has masks, so we can do mask fashion and to keep our social distance.
My friend Sylvia made these beautiful floral,
Nice.
So I keep it close by.
Raising the fashion bar. Yeah.
Well, you had mentioned children and kids and school, and I think a lot of parents are in that right now, right? Like, okay, well, we're not supposed to gather in groups of more than 10, and so they, personally in their personal lives they can get it, but then they have to send their kids to school where the same number limits may not be there, and so and then like you said, it's cold and flu season right now, and so if my kid gets the sniffles, or a little bit of a cough develops, or just kind of those kinds of things, I think parents are wondering about, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really tough on parents and kids. My son was making a timeline. I guess I have twin boys, they're 12, and I guess both of them made these timelines year by year about their life. And like 2020, he said hell. And then he said, do I have to explain why? Right. And I think that's just because of COVID. So I was struck how he had felt about this year. Maybe it's just because I'm too strict around video game time, but I think it was COVID. I think that the first thing is we all need to think about, our children are in the center of the circle, at least where I come from, surrounded by the elders, surrounded by the women, surrounded by the men, and of course our two spirit people sit at those interfaces. But I want us to all just remember to be extra supportive, of our kids, our elders, and their parents, because really tough choices around school. I was talking to another friend of mine, 3 kids of different ages, so they all have different school protocols. They decided to send their kids to school, right? Other people are deciding to keep their kids home. Some of them live with elders, right? So they need to, and they feel most comfortable. So this is a time to draw on that teaching around respect, and respect for family and individual autonomy of decision making. And then, yeah, we can all try to help each other navigate through the complexity. So for those parents that do decide with their families and kids to go back to school, we have to recognize that it's very important to keep kids home from school when they're ill. So that, and the younger the kids, of course, return to school is always a time when kids get different illnesses, right? So we need to continue to support our kids and our parents, who are also our colleagues in the workplace, understanding that, school might only be part-time, right? Our child care providers are trying to juggle. I was on a call with colleagues last Friday, and of the 2 people on the call with kids under the age of 6, both of them had their kids home because there had been these possible contacts or outbreaks in the school. In places like Toronto and other larger cities where there is going to be a density of COVID spread, we are going to see parents and kids having to deal with the fact that if there is a case or a contact in a classroom or a school, those kids are going to have to stay home for 2 weeks. Right now, the lines are too long in Toronto, and not all kids have access to testing, though we're working on that. And of course, Anishinaabe Health Toronto has an amazing mobile unit, and we're trying to work with NAMI Res to get a testing center set up. And I'm sure Joceyln and others can talk about across the country. So I guess for those of us that are in health and social service jobs, to read up locally and help support our parents and relatives, just to try to make their way through the complicated communications that come through the school. My son seems to have a case of poison ivy. I had some too. I thought I was immune, but I guess you can get allergic at any time. So he's been home the last 2 afternoons with a rash. And of course, I'm a trained doctor, and I was worried, is that a COVID ration? So,
Yeah.
Right. So that just shows. The boy across the street was quite clever, because he just wanted to stay home with his mom, who has to work, though, has a new job. So he went to school, and he told his teachers that he had a runny nose and felt sick. Right.
Oh no.
I hope there's no kids listening, right? Because you don't have to fake the illness anymore. You can just tell your teacher. And so he's home for 2 weeks, which has implications for that whole extended family. So it is a tricky time. I'm very happy that at least some kids who wanted to be in school are in school, and other kids who want to do online learning are learning. I'm very concerned about the uneven access to internet and computers, tablets. So I think overall, the rules are so complicated, it would be too hard to kind of describe them in detail, but just for us to all try to be informed and help each other, and remember that the children and the elders and the young families are at the center of the circle, and it's up to the rest of us to try to support them these days.
That's great. Well, I guess that kind of leads me to the next question is, like, a lot of the symptoms between a cold, a flu, and COVID-19 overlap. Like, it could be one or it could be the other. Is there any way that we can tell them apart, or is there something that will indicate to us one or the other? Because especially now with the lines are so long, I have major fatigue and I'm, I have a headache. Is it just because we're 6 months into this pandemic, or is it because I picked up COVID somewhere, or do I have a cough or fever because I have the flu? Is there a way that are there indications that help us to know how to tell these apart, and I guess help us decide whether or not we go get a test or not?
Yeah, it's really tough. And I would encourage people, if they can get through, if they have a primary care provider, or to call like your provincial health line, or here in Toronto, we have the Call Auntie helpline. But the problem with COVID, our tricky relative is she or he is really tricky. She, he is, they are really tricky. So what can happen, a classic case of COVID, classically involves something that feels more like a flu-like illness, right? So you feel extremely tired, you can get muscle aches, you can get a high fever, right? And then you can get a cough and difficulty breathing, right? So for example, if you compared it to strep throat, right, where it's a bacterial illness only in your throat, right? So sometimes if people are worried they have strep throat, and we try to tell the difference as primary care providers between a viral throat infection and strep throat, the difference is, the strep throat, people often have a very high fever because it's bacteria. But with COVID and the flu, they're both viral illnesses. So it's going to be very hard to tell it apart. And of course, we know with COVID, what happens is many people just only have a few symptoms or no symptoms of COVID, right? Particularly younger people. So that's why it's so important for people who feel okay about getting a flu shot to get a flu shot, right? Because if I've had my flu shot, and I will get it, I tend to get it anyways because I don't want to spread flu to other people that I work with as a doctor. Then if I start feeling like I have the flu with that whole kind of viral illness that starts with fatigue and muscle aches, right? Then I'll be more worried about COVID, right? But if you have any kind of high fever, muscle aches, cough, you should stay at home, self-isolate, not even stay in your bubble, go into your room, right? And tell people to stay away from you and your family, and put on masks when they're coming to see you if you don't want them to get really sick too, particularly anybody who's got a chronic illness or an elder person. And then colds are hard, okay? Because a common cold can actually mimic a subclinical case of COVID, right? So with the sore throat and a bit of a cough. It's gonna be pretty hard, I think, for the average non-healthcare provider to tell the difference between the three. One good news is if you stay socially distanced, wear masks and wash your hands, you won't get COVID, but you're also gonna be less likely to get the common cold and the flu. So And actually, I don't know if others on the session have noticed that, but I've heard from a lot of different people that they've actually had way less colds than they used to, since they've been careful during COVID. So I wish there was a way that I could tell you, or something that I could tell you and when I see people as a primary care provider, there are things that I see that make me more worried. But, you know, working in some of the COVID centers like this spring, you know, there was a huge variance in terms of the symptoms that people who were COVID positive had, ranging from nothing to very subtle symptoms, to becoming very ill with all of the classic symptoms of COVID-19.
Yeah, that's the hard part, is the ones you hear about the no symptoms at all. And maybe you can correct me or add anything, but one of the things that kind of helped me was remembering that it was a respiratory illness. And so those things that you talked about, the fever, the cough, the difficulty breathing, those kind of were like, okay, yeah, it's in my lungs, it's in my chest. And even though there's some of these other symptoms, if I have, they're probably not as likely to be COVID, because it's not as connected to COVID as maybe some of the other things. So like if it's really like in my sinuses, or if it's really, you know, something that's affecting my stomach or something like that, to me, that was sort of like kind of an indicator, like it still might be, but leaning more likely towards probably not.
Exactly. So I think on our first fact sheet, and those fact sheets are on the National Association of Friendship Centers webpage, like we did identify some that are less likely to be COVID or coronavirus, which included like diarrhea, like a runny or stuffy nose, or sneezing. So I have seasonal allergies, for example, so I sneeze and I can get a little bit of nasal congestion, but I wasn't worried that that was COVID. But the most common symptoms are fever, cough, trouble breathing, sore throat, aches and pains, fatigue, and headaches. So those ones,
which makes sense. If it's like affecting my lungs, it's affecting, you know, oxygen and things getting to, I mean, I don't know how bodies work, you know more than me about that, but it seems like that's a helpful thing for me to know. So then if I'm self-monitoring, I can kind of look for some of those clues as well.
Yeah.
And so when we talked last, we were kind of like at the edge of summer, and we were saying like, oh, things are going to be better because we can go outside and we can, you know, more socially distance. And, you know, we hope that something magic would happen and it would just magically go away. I mean, you were always clear, like, no, we're 4 seasons, we've only got 1 season under our belt. So now that we're at the end of summer and it's, you know, fall and looking to the winter, you know, we're going to be doing the opposite. We're going inside a lot more, and it's going to be a little bit harder, I think, to, you know, go for walks outside or to be socially distant. So I'm wondering what we can do now to kind of prepare for that colder weather, the fall and the winter, where we're going to be inside a little bit more often, not necessarily by choice, but just the nature of those seasons.
Yeah, I think we've got to be creative, right? Like, I think many of us come from like histories and contexts where we had smaller winter homes, though not all of us. Certainly there was some big houses and long houses, but those would have had probably quite a lot of ventilation, right? So there's 4 C's that you want to avoid with COVID, right? And they're crowded, close, closed, and continuous. Okay, so you want to try to, so that's like a bar or a house party. Those things are fun, right? But so like if you are going to be indoors, like we said again, and I mean, I sound like I'm this isolationist here, but you want to have few people, right? Open a window if you can. I know that can be expensive, like for heating or whatever, but yeah, hey, maybe drafty substandard housing will finally have like a good side effect. I was actually thinking, because I think there's been a run on those outdoor heaters and you can't find one in Toronto. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I could have a fire. I can have a fire pit in my backyard. Oh, hey,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I guess you have to maybe check your local bylaws, but I know here in Toronto, we're allowed to have fire pits in our backyards, and we don't have to worry about like fire warnings, I don't think, as we might have to in the summer. So yeah, open windows if you can, keep, when we are inside, of course, some of the same things we talked about in the summer gatherings, like to have a single person serving food. I'm lucky. I just got a big kitchen table my dad had built redone. So we sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table. I know that lots of people do live in like kind of smaller places or tiny homes. So then you probably we just need to get creative, right? Like I had guests come over the other night and we fed them dinner outside, but then the mosquitoes were getting bad. So they actually just were standing outside the screen door and I served them ice cream outside the screen door. It looked kind of funny, but at least we were distanced.
Yeah.
There was good ventilation and we weren't crowded. If you do need to be in close contact, like with people, try to make it for short periods of time. Like sometimes we might need to squeeze around. So the studies like of transmission among healthcare providers who are working with people with COVID showed like it was when you were in their space for more than 15 minutes. So those are some tips, but I'm gonna look forward to seeing all the creative ways within Indigenous community. I guess we need to get our layers out and get out our heavy winter clothing, right? And maybe spend a bit more time outdoors in the winter. And do some outdoor visiting. I'll have to get more resilient again. I've gotten pretty soft to cold winter weather living here in Toronto.
Yeah, embracing the winter again. I always say I was born in winter, and winter is my middle name, literally. It's winter. So I've actually been putting in some, I've been looking at snowshoes. I've been really wanting to go snowshoeing. Because it's hard. It really, depending on if you're downtown Vancouver, maybe a little bit more challenging. But if you're in rural Alberta or, even here in Ottawa, it's not too far to get to a trail somewhere. It's an option. And I've also been talking to friends about what else I can be doing inside. And so we've kind of made pacts to do activities together and just say, okay, we'll go no matter what the weather is. Like we'll just dress for it, and even just checking in virtually to go for walks and things, like even just walking. I think getting outside, it's something I feel like I've had to relearn how to do that over the summer. It's like, oh no, it's dark outside, I can't go outside. Well, there's some places that I can go. I mean, they're well lit. There's, always cars driving by. I feel safe there. And so just starting that. And now that I've done it a little bit more, it's like my body's like, oh, are we going for a walk tonight? So I think like once we find that thing that works for us and we start doing it, then our body kind of like catches up and starts even like leading us a little bit in some of those things. So I'm actually now getting excited for the colder weather and for winter. So it's I definitely hear you. This is where we kind of have to come together but stay apart, right? We're working with some of your friends to say, okay, let's go do something. We can do something. Let's find out what that is. But I like the ideas, what people coming up with. And I know for a lot of friendship centers too, they've been doing a lot of online programming. So like, here's how you make bannock, or this is my favorite bannock recipe. Why don't you share yours? And then other people are like videoing themselves making their bannock recipe, or on things like TikTok, there's been kind of viral dancing going on, and little challenges and that kind of thing. So I'm with you on that. I think our people are really creative, and that we'll find something that will fill that time.
Yeah, I need to work on my little urban East End Toronto trap line. But the other thing I was thinking about, and a little bit of echo there, hopefully it'll go away soon, was storytelling, right? And I was inspired actually because one of our community members here at Tickbird in Toronto, she just graduated from her master's in rehabilitation sciences, and she worked with some stories her father had left her. So yeah, what about trying to figure out some new old storytelling traditions, right? Netflix gets a bit boring after a while, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, what about calling up that relative that might be feeling a bit lonely, right? And seeing if you can, get a story or two, like about old time stories, new time stories, COVID stories, right? But whatever kind of stories, maybe for me, I tend to get kind of caught up in that busy life, right? But trying to actually spend a little bit of time like coming up with my own stories about stories that I've heard. So and can we do that together, right? Can we have like yarning sessions or I'm curious about that. And I talked to Tick, I said, well, how could we use storytelling then to keep us well, right? And of course, there's people much better than me to speak to that from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis perspectives. But that's something I'm interested in trying to play around with a little bit. In addition to getting outside and picking up my urban Métis trap line here in Toronto with my old cross country skis. So I'll let you know how it goes.
Okay, I kind of have to laugh because I'm just imagining a lot of like gray squirrels.
Yeah, if we're lucky.
Yeah. So we're getting closer to 8 o'clock. I can't believe it's already been that long. It's gone by very quickly, but I did want to check in on a couple of things before we have to sign off. First is about elders, and then I want to finish off with maybe some mental health techniques and some self-care talk before we wrap up, and how we can maybe have some ideas going forward. But you'd already mentioned about social isolation and talking to our elders. Maybe what are some other ways that we can ensure that our elders are taken care of, and that we're doing our best to protect them, and to make sure they're also top of mind as we're creating these ideas of how to protect ourselves and our communities.
Yeah, well, it can make us feel really good too, to help others, right? So and that can be like a mental health. I think, the things I think about with respect to mental health are gratitude, and prayer, right? As the antidote to depression. And then, doing a little good for someone else sometimes can help me feel less sorry for myself. I think we heard a lot of cooking stories, and, we've talked maybe a bit about cooking as well. I live with a pretty amazing woman, Nancy Cooper, and she was busy cooking. We picked apples. So that's another outdoor activity that we could do with some friends and stay socially distanced. And of course, then we had apple crisps galore. And then, apple crisps were leaving our house and getting delivered by car to people, right? So, but again, we're very lucky because we have the kitchen in the car, right? But if you're cooking, make an extra portion, right? You can maybe tag team with others to figure out safe ways to get it delivered, knowing that, the TTC here in Toronto can be a bit tricky. And I think we saw a huge mobilization already, across the country through friendship centers too. So I'm sure if you knew of some isolated elders, right? Trying to figure out what you can do. If you need a little bit of help, call your local friendship center and see, because almost all of them will have programs up and running. I think that's going to be really important. I called up a couple of elders I hadn't talked to for years, and that felt really good for me too. And I have some secret plans to try to come up with some mail, right? So you can even writing a letter, right? Can be something that most of us could do, right? And that could make a big difference for people. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about for the elders. How about you, Joceyln?
Yeah, I think the same thing. Unfortunately, I don't have too many access to elders where I'm at. But I do have a lot of family members who are in sort of compromised, with their immune systems, and friends that also are sort of in the similar, like an elder would be. Um, so I think we've definitely done the online. We have like the app for house parties, so it's not just you're talking, to face about things, but the it's called House Party, and so you can actually play games with people. So it's like Pictionary or like other games. So you actually like can have a few people all together playing games, and I think the FaceTiming too was something with some of the older folks in my life have been good, because it's a little bit more personal than a phone call. They really appreciate seeing your face. So yeah, definitely those things, and I'm always like extra careful with the mask, but also as I touching things, like making sure my hands are sanitized and trying to keep as much distance, and really respecting people's boundaries too. So I've often asked folks, is it okay if is it okay if I touch you, or is it okay to get closer? How close are you comfortable with? And I think that's helped people to be able to assert their boundaries, and me not getting too close inside of those bubbles, which I think is also important, which also I think goes to our elders as well.
Yeah, and I really like the reminder too about like using like different technologies. So Zoom is actually pretty friendly to use, right? Like and people can download it to their phones. But one thing people could do, like if you're a tech savvy kind of person, and yeah, that's generational, right? So what's tech savvy for me and what's tech savvy for people that are 30 years younger than me is totally different. So if maybe you're 20 years younger than me and you think you aren't tech savvy, you can probably help me. But even just like if you do have elders in your circles, like, and I do know that there has been some movements to get people phones and bandwidth and like iPads and things like that. But, my amazing partner also taught an elder how to use Zoom, right? Like, and then now they have that for the winter as well. So yeah, just trying to, like, you may have elders in your life that do have like a tablet or a smartphone, but they don't actually know how to use those functions, particularly maybe if they have an Android, because I think Apples are a little easier. So just sitting with somebody and showing them how to use that can make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, I think like one of the important things is it's not just like, oh, this is nice to do for someone else, but for me, having that connection is also really important, right? Like, and I think a lot of people have felt like this, that I can deal with the COVID. Like I listen to the local public health authority, and I'm following the best advice that's out there. So I can deal with that, but it's like the other things that have come with it, right? Like our mental health, the exhaustion, the anxiety that comes with, like just not being able to trust anything. Like second guessing things that you would do before. So I think that's been like some of the hardest things to deal with during the COVID, is just not the COVID part, but dealing with the result of that for our own mental health and self-care. So I'm wondering, some of the things that you've either instituted or advised to other people about how to take care of ourselves during this time, not just taking care of others.
Yeah. So, I mean, because I get caught up in it as well, and the anxiety. And then for those of us that work in health and social services, just feeling like there's an urgency, so it's very easy, I think, for some of us to kind of get into a crisis mode. And of course, we've grown up sometimes with different adversity, as well as awesome strengths and resiliencies. So I got a good teaching from one of the local elders and leaders in the community about patience the other week. So I've been trying to hang on to that, like patience. I think I changed one of my passwords. Yeah, just in case you want to rob me, I don't think it's my bank password, but it said calm in the face of the storm, right? I think even today, sometimes like we tend to check in and out, like at staff meetings. I work with an incredible group of people. I worry because we're all really kind of flat out working hard, but at least I think we have an environment where people can talk about when they're feeling overwhelmed. So, you know, for those of you that are in group work environments, thinking about that, I think one of my one word checkouts was pace. So for me, yeah, those are all constant verbal reminders that, you know, this is all in the end, you know, our teachings are like around like 7 generations, right? We all are just a grain of sand in the larger part of creation. So of course we do work really hard and do what we can for the good of the people. But the other thing I try to think about is this old piece of wisdom I got from a non-Indigenous colleague and helper was about holding your own oxygen mask first, right? So for those of you that have flown, right, like you hear the announcement in the case of emergency, put on your own oxygen mask first. And I know I have to do that because if I push myself too hard, of course, like many of the listeners and others, I know what my limits are. And it gets to a point where I'm not helping anybody, right? Like, because I'm too tired and then I tend to get a bit impatient and yeah, a little prickly or overly direct. So yeah, I got to go put on my own oxygen mask. My own oxygen mask has been walks and runs. My family, I am loved and very well taken care of. Puzzles. And I did try to, I had one day. Another strategy that's interesting, I don't know if anyone's ever had the opportunity to try this. I'm lucky because of course many of us have kids and can't do it, but you just try to take a day where you don't have to do anything, right? If you have people that can take care of your responsibilities, just say, I'm checking out for this day. So it's a strategy. I'm just supposed to rest. I can't usually do it the whole day. You know, watch TV or read a boring book and just sleep. So you get a little bit of a break that can go a long way. Yeah, so I think some of us, you know, in that kind of busy life, you know, cope by taking vacations or running away. We can't do that. We're at our homes now. But maybe that's a good thing. We have to face ourselves and live with ourselves. So, yeah, I think what I would just say in summary, like, is, yeah, use all the teachings and whatever works for you to like become self-aware that you might be getting into that kind of panic, like anxiety place. Yeah, just try to keep things in perspective, keep up the self-care. Yeah, we've got some amazing teachings. I feel very lucky to be a Métis person, right? Like amazing protocols, ceremonies, spirituality, religions that are gonna be tapped here and help get us through. And the most important piece of all of that for me is the web of relationships, right? The web of relationships with people. You know, the opportunity, for example, like, you know, to get to know you, Joceyln, since that day in early March, I think at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
When we reached out and decided we wanted to try to do something. But yeah, it's brought down a lot of silos. Like here, I'm happy I'm out of my research office kind of doing stuff, and it feels really good that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate all of that. It's really important to take care of ourselves in these times. And I think what we've done, and I don't know if it's you know, as Indigenous people, we feel like this extra responsibility to our families and to our communities. And I certainly always have this feeling like I'm not doing enough, you know, and it's been from friends and people that I've reached out to for support that just remind me that, you know, everything that you're doing, you know, you're probably doing your best. And so you need to be kind with yourself, to forgive yourself for you know, you don't have to do it all. You don't have to. You can ask for that help. And I think what we tried to do at NAFC is put some of those resources together. So we on our website, we actually have a COVID-19 resource, which includes some mental health resources. So if you get to like just being able to talk to somebody is really helpful. So we've got some resources on there. What's helped me is being educated in as much as I can on COVID and following the public health advice. And it's not going to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect, and we can never protect ourselves 100%, but we can really do a lot to reduce that risk and that exposure by just following what the experts are telling us. And I think for some of the other pieces is just giving yourself permission to like you say, to rest. And like you said, sometimes you can't get a whole day. You know, some people are fortunate and can take, you know, sick leave and can take a mental health day, or, you know, can have access to benefits with their work, but other people can't. Or if you have a large family or even a small family, busy family. But sometimes what I would do is say, just, okay, I'm not going to get the full day, but I can take these 10 minutes and I'm just going to close my eyes for these 10 minutes or 1 hour. I'm just going to take a walk, or I'm just going to lay down. Like that's my time that I can take that. So I find that helps kind of center and ground me a little bit too. Certainly the outreach, I find like when I get inside my own head too much, things tend to spin around and sometimes spin out of control. But in those times, I know that if I go take a walk, I usually feel much better after I come back, you know, just the fresh air and listening to music, and I can just, you know, breathe a little bit easier. And that's usually something that's pretty accessible to most people. So yeah, it's not something that's really innate in us, I think, to stop, or, you know, this idea of grind culture and you got to just push through it and all this kind of stuff. But I think it's a good reminder that doesn't come from our culture, it doesn't come from us. That you know, I really go back to what you said again about the seasons, and that, you know, there's times to rest and then there's times to be busy. And so if we don't respect those times and balance them, then, you know, we can fall out of balance. And then that's where things get really extra tricky. And that tricky relative, when they come around, we might be a little bit more tempted to let them in and to entertain them. So yeah, so those are just some of like my tips and things that have helped a lot. I've also listened to a lot of podcasts from a lot of different folks, and I find like some of them are silly and some of them are serious, but it just again helps my mind go somewhere else for a little while, and I can just pretend that things are great and wonderful and don't have to, and then I can come back to reality a little bit more rested.
This too will pass, right? This too will pass.
Okay, so thank you so much for all of your knowledge and sharing your time with me, and for everybody who's been paying attention and watching. We really appreciate anybody who's tuned in. And I'll just again mention that we've got some resources on the NAFC website, the Well Living House website, and we get to do this again 2 more times. We're going to do this on October 14th, and we're going to talk about Indigenous community-led responses to COVID. So not just us kind of talking about what we do, but more community-wide responses and how we've done that with Lori Bouvier, who's a wonderful colleague of mine from Saskatchewan. And then in November, my favorite month, because that's my birthday month.
Awesome.
We're
birthday
also,
party.
Exactly. November 4th, we're going to do one about staying strong in COVID with ceremony and traditional medicine. So talking about how do we blend these cultures, you know, with the Western and medicine and what we're hearing from current science. But, you know, we've got a lot that we already know, and how do we make sure we're respecting those medicines and those ceremonies and in these times, and using them for our health. So I'm excited. I'm really always thankful for the time I get to spend with you, and I can't wait to do it again.
Awesome. Thanks, Joceyln, and thanks everyone for joining us. Sending you all good wishes, and we'll be back.
We'll be back.